You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This is Michael Medved. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, once said that God offers special protection to drunkards, lost dogs, children, and the United States of America. We'll explore that special protection and what it means in The American Miracle. Subscribe to The American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
The corporate world is like the ocean. It's alluring, but it's also full of deadly creatures that can shred you to pieces.
It becomes kind of like a Game of Thrones political arena where everyone's trying to murder you to get your job.
My family doesn't come from corporate background, so I didn't have any sort of guidance in that.
This is not your typical work podcast.
Sometimes you need to be empathetic. And then there are times that you ask for input, but you don't really give a shit.
Listen to the Ambie Award-nominated podcast, Surfing Corporate.
Stretch opportunity? What is this, yoga class? Get out of here.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 188, The Fall of France, Reinhardt, and Rommel. While the crossings that would occur on Guderian's front at Sedan have received the most publicity over the last 80 years, part of which is always due to Guderian's own publicity skills, they were not actually the first of the Panzer forces to start crossing the Meuse River on the Ardennes front. That honor would instead go to a small number of troops that crossed the river at the village of Hue, about 4 kilometers north of Dinant. This small crossing was just one of several made along the front from Sedan in the north to Hue in the north, as the troops of the 5th, 6th, and 7th Panzer Divisions all made their own crossings as they prepared to continue their attack into the west. As these crossings developed on the 13th through the 15th, there would be a growing level of concern among French military leaders that something had to be done. But at the same time, if you remember back to episode 8 of this series, these were the exact same days when the French troops in central Belgium were fighting the battles of Hanout and Gembloux. On that sector of the front, French troops were also facing German armored troops, and so it was still unclear to many French military leaders where the real point of German emphasis was, and whether it was going to be in the south. However, even if the Meuse crossings were not the main German attack, they would still have to be dealt with, and so additional French reserves would be moved into position to counter any possible further advances from the 5th, 6th, and 7th Panzer Divisions, although these attempts at containment would be, let's call them, less than successful. Immediately to the north of Guderian's forces around Sedan, the target of the 41st Corps, commanded by General Reinhardt, would be the village of Monthermé, which was about 25 kilometers to the northwest of Sedan. Reinhardt had 2 panzer divisions under his command, the 8th and the 6th, and from the very start of the advance they had a problem. Due to the lack of roads in the Ardennes, the decision was made to place Reinhardt's troops behind those of Guderian. Then, when the roads opened back up again as the German units approached the Meuse, the hope was that they would be able to move north and quickly come into line with Guderian to the left and Hoth to the right. However, as things would develop, Reinhardt would be unable to use both of his divisions because of a changing course through Guderian's northernmost division, the 2nd Panzer. The 2nd had wandered north a bit, taking up some of the roads that the 6th and 8th needed to use, and this resulted in the 8th Panzer Division kind of being left behind. The 6th Panzer Division would stay mostly on schedule though, but the 8th would end up getting the short end of the stick and would not even cross the Meuse until the 16th of May, by which point other German armored divisions were already racing west away from the river. Because of this situation, it would be the 6th Panzer that would represent Reinhardt's corps at Monthermé, with the division commanded by General Kempf, who had commanded Panzer Division Kempf in Poland, which featured heavily in episode 116 of the podcast. Even though the 6th Division would arrive at the Meuse on the afternoon of the 13th, not long after the forces to the north and to the south, they would have to deal with some less than ideal geography as they tried to cross the river. On this area of the Meuse, as opposed to the relatively modest elevation changes along some of its course, the Meuse moves through a relatively deep gorge, with the river taking a pretty tight loop through that gorge. Reinhardt would write as his troops were coming up to the crossing of the river that, quote, The terrain really scares you. The only road leading to Monthermé snakes down into the deeply cut Meuse Valley. Their riflemen are having trouble climbing down the steep slopes leading to the Meuse River while manhandling their heavy weapons. The rubber boats have to be taken down to the Meuse in the armored personnel carriers because it is impossible to carry them down." End quote. The loop of the river created a peninsula, which would be defended by a battalion of the 42nd Colonial Infantry Regiment. The loop in the river created a peninsula, which would be defended by a battalion of the 42nd Colonial Infantry Regiment. This unit, and really the entirety of the 102nd Fortress Division, which it belonged to, were some of the best in the entire French army, and would not be any kind of pushover. They would of course benefit from the terrain that made the German attack difficult, and they would be able to trap the Germans within the peninsula, which the loop of the Meuse made in the area that the Germans would have to cross. The crossings at Monthermé would occur at roughly the same time as those at Sedan. However, there would be some serious challenges, with the first two attempts ending in failure and costing the units many casualties. But finally, the third effort by a battalion of the 4th Rifle Regiment was able to cross the river and move instantly into an attack on Monthermé. The third attack was largely successful because a single French machine gun, which had caused so many challenges for the earlier waves, had been spotted and then neutralized through direct tank fire. The village fell shortly after the first unit successfully crossed the river, and they established a good bridgehead which would then be reinforced throughout the evening and night. But even with the initial challenges at getting across the Meuse and then the quick move into Monthermé, the ordeal of the German infantry was far from over, because of the nature of the area that they had just attacked into. After crossing the river, the German forces were trapped on that peninsula, and when it came time to break out of that peninsula, they ran into some very strong French defenses. The defending troops here were aided by defenses that had been constructed in this area before the war, and from these defenses they were able to repulse the early attacks of the German infantry. However, much like at Sedan, it was really only a matter of time before the German infantry were joined by the German armored forces, and the clock on the arrival of those armored forces began shortly after the first crossings had been successful. This is because it was once again the engineers that were quickly preparing crossings, and in this case they were repairing some of the bridges that the French had tried to demolish but had not done very well. On the morning of May 14th, as the 6th Panzer was still trying to get into position to begin its breakout attempt, another timer started running. One of the agreements that had been made among the German command is that the panzer forces would be independent until the infantry units behind them had caught up. The delay at Monthermé was seen as a good excuse to make this happen, and instead of just the panzer forces there at Monthermé or under Reinhardt, the entirety of Panzer Group Kleist would be subordinated to the 12th Army. This would happen at noon on May 15th, and when news arrived at Reinhardt's headquarters of what was going to happen, the 6th Panzer's pre-planned attack, scheduled to happen on the morning of the 15th, suddenly gained new importance. At 5 a.m., this attack would begin, and in just a few hours, they had pushed through the first two lines of French defenses and were moving through the reserve lines. Once the attack had pushed through the French defenses, the commander of the 6th Panzer, General Kempf, was determined to ensure that it did not run into any new problems. To ensure this, he created what was named Pursuit Detachment von Eisenbeck, which was a combined arms task force which included armored units, motorcycle units, engineers, and then some mobile artillery and anti-tank guns. The Pursuit Detachment had one goal and one goal only: to push through as quickly as possible and continue to advance, not letting anything that the French did stop it. The detachment would be kind of unleashed in the middle of the afternoon, and it would advance 55 kilometers by 8 p.m. This created a situation in which the French could not hope to adequately respond. The detachment honestly barely had to do any fighting in its advance because it was simply advancing faster than the French units could prepare to receive them. This would be a common sight over the next week as the German forces pushed for the North Sea, but here would be an early example of French units surprised again and again that German forces were even in the areas that they were advancing from. The biggest problem for the French is that this completely compromised their entire plan to halt Guderian's push to the south. The French 6th Army had been brought in and had been put in place behind the 2nd and 9th Armies that had absorbed the German attack so far, and it was then moving into a position to the west of the Ardennes Canal, and it would be in that position that it hoped to block the advance of Guderian's forces. But suddenly, to the north, the 6th Panzer was threatening to outflank those defensive positions. This change in the situation would require a quick and decisive change by French High Command, something that they were not great at. On the German side, Kemp's rapid advance also forced changes to plans that had only been made days before. And that's because, as he moved quickly away from the Meuse, any idea of subordinating Kleist's panzer forces to the infantry were shelved, and instead the panzer forces had their orders to continue to push forward. Kempf and Guderian would then meet at the village of Montcornet, and their two bridgeheads would be joined together, trapping some French troops in between. While this was a tremendous triumph, and it preserved the independence of Panzer Group Kleist, it was also the first of what would turn into many examples in which the panzer generals would, if not disobey direct orders, at the very least use their own actions to make those orders no longer possible. Fortunately for those generals, and for the German army as a whole, I guess, these actions would almost always have a positive outcome during the fighting in France. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Does it ever feel like everybody else has all their stuff together and you don't? So many cool technologies can make that worse. Social media, even podcasts, can make it seem like others have everything together, but they probably don't. That's where BetterHelp can come in. If you've ever considered therapy, it could not be easier than with BetterHelp. All it takes is filling out a brief questionnaire, which BetterHelp uses to match you with a licensed therapist. Then you can change that therapist at any time afterwards for any reason. It's easy, it's convenient, it's flexible, and it removes as many barriers as possible between you and therapy. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/WWII today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/WWII.
400 years ago, a trio of tiny kingdoms were perched on some damp islands off the coast of Europe. Within 3 short centuries, these islands would become the centre of an empire which ruled a quarter of the globe and on which the sun never set. I'm Samuel Hume, a historian of the British Empire, and my podcast Pax Britannica follows the people and events that built that empire into a global superpower. Listen to Season 1 to hear about England's first attempts at empire building, in Ireland, in North America and in the Caribbean, the first steps of the East India Company and the political battles between king and parliament. Listen to Season 2 to hear about the chaotic years of civil war, revolution and regicide, which rocked the 3 kingdoms and the fledgling empire. In Season 3, we see how Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell ruled the powerful Commonwealth and challenged the Dutch and the Spanish for the wealth and power of the Americas and Asia. Learn the history of the British Empire by listening to Pax Britannica everywhere you find your podcasts, or go to pod.link/pax.
To the north of Reinhardt was the final collection of German armored forces that were cascading towards the Meuse, the 15th Motorized Corps under the command of General Hoth. The goal of the Corps and its 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions under Hoth's command was the crossing point on the Meuse around the Belgian city of Dinant. While the Germans did not know it, this area of the front was not defended as well as it was supposed to be because of the French 18th Division, which had not yet arrived to take up their positions along the river. The first crossing of the river would occur at 11 p.m. on May 12th, when a reconnaissance group from the 5th Panzer found a crossing site near the village of Hue. This was nothing more than a 1-meter-wide dam across the river, but it had not been destroyed by the French defenders, nor was it guarded by any French forces. This was a tremendous find because it allowed German forces to quickly move across the river without having to resort to using boats. This meant that by early in the morning of the 13th, there were 3 battalions of rifle infantry across the river at Hue, which was more than enough to reinforce the bridgehead that had been created by these smaller recon units. They would then begin to advance, not stopping until they had advanced 4 kilometers to the west. During this advance, they would experience opposition from the French forces that were in the area, and in general, these troops fought hard to hold back the German advance, but there were simply not enough of them. The French forces were not totally taken by surprise after the crossing occurred. They had discovered that the Germans had started crossing early on the 13th, but they did not have the power to counterattack immediately, and even with reinforcements inbound, the German reinforcements simply arrived first. Even the arrival of some French armored units could not turn the tide against the German infantry. Unfortunately for the French commanders, this fighting at Hue was not even the point of greatest danger along their sector of the front, but it did distract them and pulled in French reinforcements that may have been better used to the south, where the 7th Panzer was about to make its own crossing of the river. The plan for the 7th Panzer was to try and cross at 2 different points. The northernmost crossing point was a bit south of Hue, with the other being further south just to the north of Dinant and at the village of Leffe. In both areas, the troops that were attempting to cross would run into strong French resistance, which made the possibility of a crossing on the morning of the 13th anything but a sure thing. In some ways, this is where the myth of the German general Erwin Rommel begins, although his actions in North Africa a few years later would be far more famous. Rommel was in command of the 7th Panzer Division, and he spent the day bouncing back and forth between the 2 crossing points, arranging for support for those that were trying to cross, and then trying to provide a bit of morale boosts, I guess, to the soldiers and officers. There would even be a moment where he would take personal command of an infantry battalion at a critical moment, with Rommel later recounting that, quote, "I now took over personal command of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Rifle Regiment, and for some time directed operations myself. I crossed the Meuse in one of the first boats, and at once joined the company which had been across since early morning," end quote. On another occasion, he would personally assist some engineers that were trying to build a bridge across the river, wading into waist-deep water. In many ways, this was closer to Rommel, the assault unit commander that had been seen at Caporetto in 1917, than the general that would be seen in North Africa. But I guess it's hard to argue with results. Both of the crossings would eventually be successful, with the units of the 6th Rifle Regiment crossing south of Hue, while the 7th Rifle Regiment crossed at Leffe. The crossings south of Hue were able to link up with the units that had crossed across the dam at Hue, bringing together the forces of the 5th and 7th Panzer. Then in the south, the smaller bridgehead was manned by troops of the 7th Panzer only, although efforts were being made by the afternoon of the 13th to bring together all of these bridgeheads into one unified bridgehead. On the French side, and I know you're getting tired of me talking about this, but the French would kind of just dither away their chances throughout the day to attack the Germans when they were at their weakest. This area of the front was commanded by General Korup's 9th Army. However, his ability to react to the situation was hampered by the fact that this area of the front was defended by the 18th Infantry Division, which was still, didn't even have all of its troops in the area yet. Reinforcements could have been rushed into the area, but there were some communication challenges along the French chain of command. On this area of the front, the biggest challenge is that each step up of the chain of command, from the front all the way back to Army Command, had this problem where each step of the chain seemed to believe that the officer under them had been exaggerating and that the situation could not be as bad as they were saying. This resulted in every step of the chain altering their understanding of the situation before they communicated it up the chain, where the same situation would then occur. This meant that by the time that the message reached General Georges, the commander of the entire Northeast Front, he was simply told that a battalion had gotten in trouble at Hue, instead of the real situation, which was that there were elements of 2 panzer divisions crossing the river and pushing forward. Instead, the message he got again was just that a battalion had gotten into some trouble. Near the front, several different officers at different levels tried to arrange for counterattacks with the forces available, but it was always going to be a challenge. One counterattack, which involved a collection of random units from a variety of different commands, actually got close to pushing to the river before running out of steam just after dark. Eventually, the attack had to be called off altogether because there were concerns that the tanks, which were leading the effort, had become disconnected from their supporting infantry as it grew darker. There was a hope, though, and this was due to the presence of the French 1st Armored Division nearby. They were only about 35 kilometers away. The 1st Armor was commanded by General Bruno, and his division started moving at roughly midnight on May 14th, about 24 hours after the first German troops had crossed the river at Hue. This division had previously been held in reserve for the armies further north, with the assumption being that they would be required to replace some of the French forces that were fighting near the Gembloux Gap as the campaign developed. It was mostly just a coincidence that they were positioned to even attempt a counterattack here. It was just kind of luck of where they'd been placed. The challenge was the fact that the 1st Armored could not move at anything close to what you would call fast. They would move about 20 kilometers, so still about 15 kilometers to the west of Dinant over the course of the 14th, although not all of this was down to the French tanks or soldiers, but was instead caused due to delays that were caused by miscommunication. Now again, that was them moving about 20 kilometers. Remember, we just talked about a German force that had advanced 55 kilometers in just a few hours. That's kind of the speed difference. It took them a day to go 20 kilometers versus a couple hours to go over 50. Now, some French forces spent most of the day just kind of hanging out, waiting for orders to arrive. But even when they did, the French Char B1 tanks generally had terrible fuel mileage and had to be refueled. This then ran into the problem that the French used special fuel trucks for this purpose, and those trucks had very poor cross-country performance. And apparently the roads in this area of Belgium were simply not good enough for them. All of this meant that the 1st Armor was not really ready to begin any kind of counterattack until about 9 p.m. on the 14th. But orders were generally pretty clear that this attack had to happen and as soon as possible, with General Korapp telling General Bruno that, quote, "You must counterattack this evening with all you have. That's a formal order." However, even with this very clear, formal, in fact, order, it was simply impossible for the French armor to get organized and ready to attack before May 15th. Unfortunately for the French chances, this allowed time for a German bomber attack to hit several of the fuel convoys that were moving forward to try and keep the French tanks running. This was exacerbated by the fact that the French were heavily reliant on these fuel trucks. They really didn't have a lot of flexibility about how they moved fuel forward. Like, there wasn't an equivalent of what would become known as the jerry can or gas cans that the Germans often used. Like, they just didn't have that kind of flexibility. So once the fuel trucks were destroyed or were hindered in any way, it became much more difficult to keep their armored forces moving forward. Even with the poor fuel situation, the French would still launch their counterattack in what would come to be known as the Battle of Flavien on May 15th. Now, the German armored forces in this case were able to use their better tactics to counteract the fact that none of their tanks were actually able to stand up to a Char B in a one-on-one situation. It was more heavily armed and more heavily armored. But instead, the German tanks used their far superior coordination with their more modern radio equipment, allowing them to get around to the flanks of the French tanks and at times even to coordinate with other artillery and anti-aircraft units so that they could use their larger guns to disable and destroy the French armored vehicles. The disastrous day, or counterattack that would ensue, would result in only 36 of the French tanks still working by the end of the day. Given the fact that the division had started the day with 170, that's quite a reduction, 170 down to 36. The reason for the failure of the French counterattack was that much like at Sedan, the German engineers had done everything in their power to get German armored forces across the river as quickly as possible. But unlike at Sedan, Rommel did not wait for a bridge to be built before tanks were moved across the river. And whereas Guderian had prioritized supplies and support units during the period where ferries were the only way to cross the river, Rommel included tanks on those ferries. This did not remove the great need for that bridge. Everyone knew that to really support and expand the bridgehead, a bridge would be required to move tanks across, but these ferries allowed for tanks to get across a little bit faster and be able to respond to French efforts just a few hours earlier. Frantic building would eventually allow a bridge to be built, and this bridge would be placed on the 7th Panzer's sector, which was important because they really only had enough material to build one bridge, and Rommel was able to kind of demand that he be given the bridging equipment, which allowed him to give priority to his forces as they moved across the Meuse, with the tanks of the 5th Panzer given kind of a lower priority, which would give the 7th the premier position in the advance that would follow. While this would not have a major impact on the course of the campaign, in many cases, a German tank was a German tank. It didn't matter necessarily who commanded it or how it got across the river, just that German tanks were moving across the river on a bridge. The priority given to the 7th Panzer would do nothing but help Rommel's later reputation, as it gave him the ability to push forward quickly after the crossing was secure. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me next episode, in which we will investigate some of the French counterattacks that would have happened against Guderian's forces near Sedan. Spoiler alert, they're not going to go very well.